early October 2025, just as Russia announced another stabilization phase in its border regions, a sudden flash over Belgorod turned the sky crimson. Could a single precision strike really pierce the illusion of security built over 2 decades? Within minutes, 500,000 residents of this Russian city found themselves plunged into total darkness. The Luch thermal power plant, the beating heart of Belgorod's grid, had been hit by a volley of American-made HIMARS rockets, launched from Ukrainian positions near Kharkiv. Eyewitness footage posted to Telegram showed a vast column of flame rising above the city before all lights vanished. This was no temporary blackout. It was the sudden silencing of an entire urban system. Water pumps ceased, traffic lights froze, and cell towers died. According to Reuters and BBC monitoring, the strike paralyzed 8 administrative districts and disrupted railway signaling that supplied the southern front. For the first time since the invasion began, Russia's own population felt the physical consequences of a war once portrayed as distant. From a domino effect analysis view, the loss of one node, Belgorod's grid triggered cascading failures across transportation, communication, and industry. When the lights went out, train convoys carrying ammunition to Donbass stalled mid-route. Fuel pumps at depots lost pressure. Internet exchanges linking military commands flickered offline. Each interruption compounded the next, until the region resembled a machine whose gears had seized all at once. Western analysts at the Royal United Services Institute compared it to cutting oxygen to a battlefield brain. Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov's statement that missile alert systems may malfunction was effectively an admission that state control had cracked. Even Kremlin-friendly outlets struggled to explain why a supposedly well-defended rear zone was incapacitated by a few dozen rockets. Satellite imagery reviewed by Defense News showed scorched substations and destroyed switching yards, evidence that precision targeting had replaced brute force. President Trump's White House, in a brief comment, called the strike proof of technological asymmetry on the modern battlefield, underscoring how Ukraine's NATO-backed intelligence could reach deep into Russia's core. Psychologically, the attack demolished Putin's 20-year social contract obedience in exchange for stability. That night, stability failed. Local telegram channels overflowed with panicked people trapped in elevators, cash-only shops, and endless gas station lines for generators. What had been whispers, "Why is this war happening to us?" became open cries. Analysts at DW argued that the blackout marked the first true domestic fracture of the Russian war narrative. From here, the narrative only deepens. If one thermal plant could paralyze half a province, what would happen when Ukraine scaled the strategy to multiple targets? Meanwhile, Russian commanders faced a graver question. Still, how could they fight a high-tech war when the home front was collapsing into darkness? What followed next would expose just how fragile Russia's military-industrial heartbeat truly was. By dawn on October 2, 2025, Belgorod had transformed into a city of silent intersections and candlelit apartments. How could one night of war reduce a modern metropolis to pre-industrial stillness? The blackout had spread through the region's interconnected infrastructure, triggering what energy analysts at Al Jazeera described as the largest urban systems collapse in Western Russia since the Soviet era. From a domino effect analysis perspective, the HIMARS strike had not merely destroyed a power station, it had dismantled the logic of everyday life. Without power, water utilities could no longer maintain pressure in pipelines, forcing hospitals to ration supplies. The regional internet backbone, managed through state-owned Rostelecom, went offline within minutes. Within hours, Belgorod's main railway depot, vital for sending ammunition to the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army, was immobilized, its signaling network dead. Dozens of freight trains carrying tanks and fuel stood idle along the tracks. Each halted train became a new domino in the chain of paralysis. The opportunity cost was even greater. To restore power, Moscow dispatched mobile energy units and engineers from other regions, resources urgently needed for the reconstruction of occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. BBC News cited defense insiders who admitted that diverting logistics to Belgorod would slow operations in Zaporizhzhia and Crimea. In short, Russia had to rob its front lines to rescue its rear. The more it fixed, the more it weakened elsewhere. Civilians, meanwhile, lived the war in ways previously reserved for Ukrainian cities. Telegram footage verified by the New York Times showed endless queues for bottled water, panic buying in supermarkets, and drivers sleeping in cars to keep warm. Some locals reported hearing jet engines overhead and mistook returning Russian aircraft for incoming drones, testimony to how fear had seeped into daily routine. "It's like the war has come to my kitchen," one resident told DW. Strategically, this chaos struck at the heart of Putin's domestic narrative control. Kremlin-controlled outlets tried to portray the incident as a transformer malfunction, but NASA's firm's satellite and Russian social media contradicted that instantly. Western experts framed it as a psychological turning point. Michael Kaufman of the Carnegie Endowment noted that Russia's promise of invulnerability died the night Belgorod went dark. President Trump, addressing reporters at the White House, called it a stark reminder that energy infrastructure is the soft underbelly of modern warfare. His comment hinted at growing U.S. intelligence involvement in helping Ukraine refine these precision strikes. NATO officials privately told Defense News that the attack validated years of investment in joint targeting and satellite reconnaissance, implying an alliance role more direct than previously acknowledged. As Belgorod's nights grew colder and its residents angrier, the political fallout in Moscow deepened. How long could propaganda sustain a narrative of stability when millions could not charge their phones or buy bread? This was no longer about missiles, it was about perception. And in the age of digital warfare, perception is power. Yet the true magnitude of Ukraine's plan was only beginning to surface. If Belgorod was the opening act, what would happen when the next strike targeted the arteries that fed Russia's southern front? Meanwhile, Russian engineers raced to restart the grid, unaware that the next wave of attacks was already in motion. On October 5, 2025, 3 nights after the Belgorod blackout, analysts at Defense News confirmed what Ukrainian military channels had hinted: the HIMARS strike was not an isolated hit, but part of a meticulously layered operation. How could a nation with limited firepower orchestrate such precision across an enemy this vast? The answer lay in Ukraine's growing mastery of information warfare and Western targeting data. According to BBC defense correspondents, the operation was divided into 3 synchronized phases: decoy, saturation, and precision. Hundreds of low-cost drones, many 3D printed domestically or assembled from Western kits, were launched to overwhelm Russian air defenses. This domino effect began in the air. Every intercepted drone forced Russia to expend expensive surface-to-air missiles, drawing fire away from critical sectors. Once radars and missile launchers were distracted, the second phase began: the HIMARS volley. Only a handful of rockets were required. Each was guided by NATO-provided satellite reconnaissance that pinpointed the Luch thermal plant's exact coordinates. This strategic contrast perspective reveals an uncomfortable irony. While Russia continues to bombard Ukraine's power grid, hoping to freeze civilians into submission, Ukraine struck a single Russian plant and achieved broader military and psychological results. The Kremlin's doctrine of deep defense crumbled under its own weight. Fortifying the front had left the rear blind. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War showed that Belgorod's anti-aircraft systems were focused southwest toward Kharkiv, not realizing the HIMARS would approach from the northeast. As The Guardian noted, this reflected Russia's mirror strategy problem: preparing for the last war instead of the current one. The opportunity cost analysis exposes another painful truth. Replacing the destroyed turbines and transformers could take months, draining resources from other industrial regions. According to Russia's energy ministry, estimates leaked to Al Jazeera, emergency reconstruction would require rerouting equipment originally intended for refineries near Kursk and Samara, further weakening supply lines. In essence, to fix Belgorod, Russia must sacrifice elsewhere. The Kremlin's response underscored its anxiety. Intelligence sources cited by Reuters confirmed that Moscow redeployed S-400 batteries from Kaluga to Belgorod, effectively thinning the defense perimeter around the capital. NATO strategists saw this as a quiet victory. Every missile battery moved inward was one less guarding the front lines. The Financial Times quoted a senior European defense official describing the move as Russia's defensive cannibalism, protecting its heart by exposing its limbs. At the same time, Western intelligence noted that Ukrainian engineers had begun adapting AI-assisted targeting algorithms to identify grid vulnerabilities in real time. Each successful strike provided data for the next. By combining public satellite images, intercepted frequencies, and human intelligence, Ukraine's strike network had evolved into what US analysts called a self-learning battlefield brain. For Russian commanders, the implications were terrifying. Belgorod was no longer just a blackout, it was a blueprint for future paralysis. And if a single node could dismantle the system, how many more nodes could Ukraine exploit before winter set in? Meanwhile, deep within the Kremlin, senior aides reportedly debated whether to classify the Belgorod strike as an act of foreign terrorism to justify harsher domestic crackdowns. Yet such rhetoric could not disguise the growing truth the war's front line had moved inside Russia itself. What came next would push that realization even deeper into the very foundations of its war economy. By mid-October 2025, Russia's logistics backbone began to fracture in slow motion. Could one city's blackout truly ripple through an empire built on oil and steel? The answer emerged from within the railway maps and production reports, leaking out of Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk. Proof that Ukraine's strike had triggered a full-scale domino effect across the war machine. The Belgorod rail junction, responsible for funneling ammunition and fuel to Donbass, remained paralyzed for more than a week. According to Reuters, over 70 freight convoys were immobilized, including trains loaded with T-90M tanks and BMP-3s. Signal relays fried by the HIMARS impact left traffic controllers blind. Without electricity, backup diesel engines could move only a fraction of the cargo. DW reported that officers had to manually flag trains through intersections, like in the 1940s, wasting precious days of supply. From an opportunity cost perspective, every stalled train meant delayed artillery on the front and lost battlefield momentum. Russia was forced to divert mobile generators from occupied territories and cut power rations to factories in Oryol and Voronezh just to relight Belgorod's grid. As Defense News observed, each megawatt restored in Belgorod is a megawatt denied to the front. Industry suffered the same fate. Factories once producing mortar shells and tank armor stood still as robotic arms froze mid-cycle. Even after temporary power returned, fluctuating voltage damaged machinery beyond repair. A confidential BBC analysis estimated output in Belgorod's industrial belt dropped by 45% in 2 weeks, an unspoken crisis inside Russia's Ministry of Industry. The strategic contrast perspective exposed the cruel symmetry of events. Putin's doctrine sought to exhaust Ukraine by severing its energy lifelines during winter 2022. Yet in 2025, Ukraine reversed the logic. It weaponized precision, not scale. Instead of mass bombardment, it struck one power node and crippled the logistics Russia needed to sustain its own offensives. Western experts viewed this as a strategic revolution. RAND analyst Dara Massakat told Al Jazeera Ukraine turned the Kremlin's strengths, its depth, its industry into vulnerabilities by forcing it to defend everywhere at once. US President Trump echoed the sentiment, saying the Belgorod strike proved what modern warfare really means. Who controls the switch controls the fight. His administration reportedly approved additional battlefield radar sharing under NATO coordination, a subtle escalation that Moscow denounced as covert interference. Meanwhile, Russian morale decayed. Soldiers on the Zaporizhzhia line complained via intercepted calls that food convoys had stopped arriving. No power, no fuel, no hot meals, one soldier muttered in a clip verified by NYT. The blackout had transformed into hunger at the front. From the domino effect view, each system collapse fed another logistics production morale, until even propaganda faltered. State TV canceled evening news due to transmission failures in Belgorod. For the first time, silence became Russia's loudest broadcast, yet this was not the end. Intelligence suggested Ukraine's next objectives lay deeper within Russia's infrastructure network: pipelines, refineries, and communication hubs. If Belgorod was the test, the sequel would measure how far the shockwaves could travel. What followed would not just challenge Russia's logistics, but its entire sense of invulnerability. By late October 2025, the lights were slowly returning to Belgorod, but the damage to public confidence could not be repaired with electricity alone. How could Moscow restore faith in its power when even the hum of refrigerators had become a reminder of vulnerability? The blackout's psychological aftershocks now spread faster than the physical repairs. Telegram groups overflowed with anger, sarcasm, and questions the Kremlin could no longer suppress. From a domino effect analysis angle, Ukraine's HIMARS strike had achieved more than infrastructure collapse. It cracked the invisible wall of obedience. Once the illusion of state control broke, fear turned into inquiry. Why did our army defend empty fields while our children froze? Asked one viral post flagged by DW. BBC Monitoring reported similar sentiment across neighboring regions, proof that energy, once a weapon of control, had become a spark of rebellion. The opportunity cost was now political. Instead of focusing on the southern front, Moscow's leadership was consumed with internal damage control. The New York Times quoted a senior European diplomat saying, "Every ruble spent restoring Belgorod is a ruble not spent defending Melitopol." Russian ministries quietly redirected funds from weapons procurement to emergency energy subsidies. Analysts at Defense News estimated that the reconstruction of Belgorod's grid alone would consume the equivalent of 3 months of Russia's missile production budget. From the strategic contrast perspective, this was Putin's nightmare made visible. The war meant to preserve Russian strength was instead devouring it. The Kremlin had promised stability and protection. Belgorod had received darkness and silence. Western experts like Michael Clark of King's College London told Al Jazeera, "The strategic paradox is complete. Russia sought to make Ukrainians cold, but it is Russians now shivering in their own basements." President Trump, during a White House press briefing, described the incident as a live case study in 21st century hybrid warfare, confirming that NATO analysts were using satellite telemetry from the strike to refine joint defense doctrines. For NATO's eastern members, Poland, Romania, and the Baltics, the Belgorod attack demonstrated how precision and coordination could neutralize a numerically superior foe. The West was learning as much from this operation as Ukraine itself. Meanwhile, Moscow's propaganda machine began to stumble. Television presenters avoided mentioning Belgorod altogether, but citizens no longer relied on state TV, they relied on each other. Candlelight stories and shared generator fuel became acts of defiance. Sociologists from the independent Levada Center observed a measurable dip in Putin's domestic approval ratings, citing the sudden proximity of war. Psychologically, Ukraine had shifted the battlefield from the trenches of Donbass to the living rooms of Russia. The question was no longer who will win, but who will endure longer. The blackout had lit a fuse that no amount of censorship could extinguish. Yet in Kyiv, the operation was seen as only a beginning. Intelligence leaks to Reuters suggested Ukraine was mapping another series of strikes against deeper logistical arteries, fuel depots in Bryansk, and communication hubs near Rostov. The war's next phase, experts warned, would decide not just territory, but the survival of Russia's industrial pulse. What followed next would reveal whether Ukraine could sustain this tempo, or whether Moscow would retaliate in ways that might redraw the very rules of escalation. As November 2025 approached, the Belgorod blackout was no longer just a news event, it had become a symbol. Could this single night mark the point where the war crossed from military confrontation into systemic collapse? Western analysts increasingly believed so. The precision strike that plunged 500,000 Russians into darkness had illuminated something far greater: the fragility of Russia's entire strategic foundation. From the domino effect analysis viewpoint, the impact was measurable across every axis of Russian power. Energy, logistics, and morale, three pillars of modern warfare, had all fractured. Reuters reported that subsequent strikes on secondary substations in Kursk and Bryansk further delayed military supply chains, forcing Moscow to suspend rotations to the Zaporizhzhia front. The blackout's legacy had metastasized into chronic disruption. The opportunity cost kept climbing. Russia's Ministry of Energy admitted that rebuilding Belgorod's grid would require more than 14,000 tons of copper and steel materials, now unavailable for tank and artillery production. Defense News noted that redirecting industrial supply meant at least 6 major munitions plants would face shortages this winter. Each transformer installed in Belgorod was one less shell on the battlefield, a trade-off that no general could justify. Under the strategic contrast perspective, Ukraine's precision warfare exposed the gulf between Russia's ambitions and its actual resilience. Moscow's 2025 strategy had been to outlast Kyiv through attrition. Instead, it was Kyiv that had learned endurance through innovation. NATO's intelligence networks, integrated under the Trump administration's renewed Allied Fusion program, allowed Ukraine to anticipate targets with near-perfect timing. Western experts told Al Jazeera that the Belgorod operation will be studied for decades, as the moment the home front became the battlefield. Even within Russia's military establishment, quiet panic spread. Leaked communications cited by BBC described commanders requesting fortified power nodes for bases as far east as Saratov. This defensive overreaction drained more resources, confirming what RAND analysts termed the spiral of internal consumption. The more Russia sought to protect itself, the weaker it became abroad. Meanwhile, Ukraine's resilience had inspired NATO to expand its data-sharing program beyond surveillance into predictive modeling. According to NYT, AI systems now simulate how each infrastructure hit could ripple through Russia's supply web, calculating second- and third-order effects in real time. It was the war's next frontier: algorithmic attrition. The Kremlin, faced with growing unrest at home and logistical paralysis at the front, fell back on rhetoric. Putin condemned the attacks as terrorism against civilians, but even loyal commentators struggled to repeat the line convincingly. Russians had seen the footage. They had felt the cold. No propaganda could hide the silence of dead machines. From NATO's strategic lens, the Belgorod strike was more than a tactical success. It was proof that asymmetric precision could reshape deterrence in Eastern Europe. The West had witnessed how a smaller, networked military could bleed a giant by targeting its arteries instead of its armor. "It's the dawn of the infrastructure war," said one Pentagon analyst quoted by Defense News. As winter closed in, one question lingered across both sides of the conflict: If power could be turned off in Belgorod tonight, whose lights might go out next? The darkness that fell over Russia was no longer temporary. It was strategic.